So the conventional wisdom right now is that Graham Plattner could win the Senate race against Susan Collins because of his economic populism, his left populism, and in spite, and that's the thing I want to take on here today, in spite of his personal problems, right? We'll get more into that in a second. So I heard a key word in Graham Plattner's acceptance speech that kind of clicked for me a little bit. And I think it's a word and a message that people should take note of, because I think it will be important for politics generally in our era. And it's something that people should be consciously aware of if they're working in political communication or if they are on the receiving end of political messaging, as many of us are as we run up to the midterms. And the way that I want to get into this, I don't want to be too pretentious or intellectualize this too much, but I think that there is a lot in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism that can help us here to understand what's going on. Now, this video is neither an endorsement of Graham Plattner, nor is it a suggestion that Graham Plattner is like leading us to totalitarianism. That's not why I'm using this book. The reason is because Hannah Arendt, I think, has some categorizations of social politics or social political dynamics in the last century that are super relevant for us right in this moment. So let me just get right into it. The conventional wisdom around Graham Plattner at the moment is that he is giving a left populist message and therefore he could win the Senate seat in Maine. Completely reasonable take for people to have. Add to that, Graham Plattner has been getting, when people have opposed Graham Plattner, be it his primary opponent, whose name escapes me at the moment, or be it just mainstream media trying to ask him questions, right? The thing that they gravitate to are the things in his personal life, some of his personal shortcomings, which exist. And again, I'm not here to endorse or do apologetics for Graham Plattner. So I'll just leave it at that for the moment. But the theme that I heard in his acceptance speech a couple weeks ago was this theme of alienation. And I wanted to dwell on there a little bit because generally speaking, when people talk about alienation, they're using it in the sense of economics, in the sense of Marxist alienation. So what did alienation mean in that particular context? Well, imagine the world before the Industrial Revolution, right on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. Maybe in your basic economics course, right, you heard about someone before the Industrial Revolution. That's the late 1700s in Great Britain. And then generally speaking in Europe, the 1800s up until the revolutions of 1848 showed how the Industrial Revolution was changing the politics of Europe. Let's imagine you're a carpenter, right? A tradesman, some sort of an artisan in this period of time, and the Industrial Revolution comes, and you are transformed from someone who builds furniture start to finish and sells to a customer directly. Perhaps you have I'm just making this up, obviously, but perhaps you have a furniture shop somewhere, and people come in and they say, I want a chair. You build them the chair, you go out and get the wood, or you at least know the person who goes out and chops the wood, you build them the chair, right? From start to finish, from beginning of conception, soup to nuts, all the way to the sale, you were involved in producing that commodity that someone then purchases, that product, right? Marxist alienation generally is the idea, and we're speaking here in broad brushstrokes, Marxist alienation is the thing that says, okay, as the Industrial Revolution comes, and as the economic process becomes more atomized, becomes more individualized, because that carpenter now is replaced by a company owned by a owner who then has you working in a factory to build just one specific part of that chair that you were originally doing from start to finish. You're now a factory worker, and you build only one aspect of the chair, or maybe the chair comes past you on the assembly line and you inspect it to make sure that it's good at the very end, or perhaps you just hammer in one nail on that chair, and then it goes out of the factory and it is sold somewhere where you have no interface with the customer. And so you are then alienated from the process of your work. You're alienated both from the beginnings of that chair building, and you're alienated from the endpoint of that chair being sold. Neither are you really taking part in the craft of making the chair. You're only doing like one single part of that. And so therefore you feel alienated from that process, right? I think that's something that most people today can at least relate to, right? And so when the Industrial Revolution then turned people who were previously craftsmen or previously artisans into alienated wage workers, the general dynamic there that is then identified in economic terms is class, right? After you are transformed into a wage worker, you'll get a fancy title as being part of the proletariat, right? You are a proletarian and you're part of the proletariat. That is the large working class of people, everyone who's been alienated from whatever they were doing before. They've been brought from the agricultural world into the cities to work in factories, or if they're still working in agriculture, they're doing so in a mechanized way. Perhaps they're going into debt with big companies that are providing them that mechanization that is required to compete, yada, yada, yada. There is a difference between agricultural, quote unquote, peasants and the proletariat, but that's not super important to our discussion right now. The point that I wanted to make, though, is that society then breaks down into other classes, right? So the traditional story goes that you also have the bourgeoisie. Now, the bourgeoisie, broadly speaking, is a French term that just means, for now, the ownership class. So when you're working there in your factory on the floor and you're building your widget, you're only one part of the widget, right? And you're alienated from your work. You can look up and you have that stereotypical factory floor where the bosses look down from up on high on like a scaffolding or in an office or something, right? Obviously, this is all just my imaginary conjecture about what was going on, but you have the ownership class, right? You have the fat cat with the cigar and the monocle, Monopoly man, right? Who owns all the stuff. And though you're alienated, he is getting, or she, I guess, but mostly he, is benefiting from your labor, right? So you're alienated from your labor. You're only getting a wage that represents perhaps a small portion of the value that you create. And the bourgeois class is therefore exploiting you, right? Now, traditional Orthodox Marxist taking before in any innovations from someone like Rosa Luxemburg or Vladimir Lenin, who said that the working class needs to be represented by a vanguard party that will take power. Before all that, the traditional Marxist view was that there would be a general raising of class consciousness, that is, that the movement of history would help the proletariat to realize that they are working class, and then they would take power. And this is where we can start to integrate Hannah Arendt's opinions on the matter, because Hannah Arendt presents history a little differently. She buys in generally to the idea that there was bourgeoisie and working class, bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? Ownership class and working class. She buys into the view that in the late 19th century, during the scramble for Africa, that capitalism itself needed to be exported, that basically it started to reach the upper limits of what it could achieve in one specific country or national territory, and therefore it went seeking new markets in places like South Africa. And she points out that when it does arrive in South Africa, it tends to work in some of the more superfluous industries rather than like specific industrial development. In South Africa, capitalism revolves around mining, gold, diamonds, etc. But more important than that, what happens in the late 20th century that Hannah Arendt points out is that this is actually the moment when the bourgeoisie and the ownership class is quote unquote politically emancipated. Now, when Hannah Arendt says that they're emancipated, usually we think about the word emancipation in the context of slavery. So you think about the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln, when during the Civil War he decided that anyone who was still in the rebelling South who was a slave was freed, at least on paper, as of the moment of the Emancipation Proclamation. We're not talking about the freedom from slavery in this case. Political emancipation in the Arendtian context is the idea that you become politically active, that you come to wield your political power. So in the French Revolution in 1789 until Napoleon's coup in the late 1790s and the declaration of the French Empire under Napoleon, what revolution takes place in France is what's called generally a peasant revolution. That is, that the peasants themselves that were out working the land, the past feudal peasantry class, the feudal system started to break down, but still the peasants are living in deeply unequal circumstances out in the countryside. It is generally the reappropriation of land during the French Revolution and the idea and the rights of man that all are equal in political rights, and therefore all people in France will now be able to participate in the political process by voting, for example, and representing the nation, the transformation from being a subject to a citizen. This is what Hannah Arendt in the French context calls the emancipation of the peasants. In the late 19th century, so really about 100 years after the French Revolution, what we have is the awakening of the bourgeoisie and their emphasis on using their newfound political power to affect what the state does. And what she says the bourgeoisie does in the late 19th century is convince the power of the state, the monopoly of force that the state has, to enforce property abroad, to enforce the bourgeoisie's political investments, monetary, economic investments in the various empires of the Western European nation states, to basically use the state to enforce the property of the bourgeoisie, something that was not particularly needed prior to this grand scramble for Africa. What was the state doing for the bourgeoisie prior, and why was the bourgeoisie and the ownership class not interested, according to Hannah Arendt previously? Well, previously, during the initial Industrial Revolution, the only thing that the state does for the bourgeoisie and the ownership class is provide police force that will enforce property rights. That is basically what Hannah Arendt says is the purpose of the state to the bourgeoisie prior to imperialism. It is because of this expansive investment and use of what she calls superfluous capital all around the world, but particularly in like South Africa, in Northern Africa, like Algeria and Egypt, and then in India, various empires being involved. The German Empire comes into its own in this period. Because of all of these things, what the bourgeoisie, what the ownership class needs is that the state will then ensure their investments all around the world. They will use state power outside of the territory of the nation state itself. So if you are the British Empire and you're using your investments in South Africa, what you need for your gold mine is the protection of the state all the way from the mainland to come to South Africa and help protect your property, like the police force domestically, but somewhere else, right, in South Africa. Now, this is where Arendt's analysis takes a bit of a turn, because she introduces us to the idea here of the mob. She introduces the mob a little bit earlier in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. If you ever read it, I recommend it. But what Hannah Arendt says is that there is both superfluous capital and superfluous men during the imperialist period. So the superfluous capital comes from the bourgeoisie that has extra money lying around because they've basically done all they can do to develop capitalist industry in their country, and so they have superfluous capital that needs to then go around the world to help make money beget more money. Hannah Arendt here borrows quite liberally from Rosa Luxemburg and from Vladimir Lenin, writing in the 1910s, both of them on this very subject. Hannah Arendt adapts that theme to describe this example of superfluous capital then going abroad to build imperialism. What she adds there, though, is that there are also superfluous men themselves that represent the mob that then go abroad to help imperialism, that basically benefit from the bourgeoisie sending their superfluous capital abroad, bringing the state abroad to enforce that capital investment. You need a group of people then to be part of that colonial project, or that imperialist project, to use the precise wording that she would use. Who is the mob? The mob, Arendt says, is the refuse or the residue of the classes. So if you are a working person in the early Industrial Revolution in that factory with the chair we were talking about, putting the widget on the chair, hammering in the nail, you're part of the proletariat, you're part of the working class. But now imagine that there is a recession, or that you lose your job for one reason or another, and you are no longer even working for a wage. You're no longer even experiencing the general alienation you would feel in the best of circumstances working in a factory, right? That life is already somewhat immiserating, probably very immiserating. you're already kind of miserable. Now imagine you are kicked out of that miserable situation and you have no means to take care of yourself, where your life goes from being bad to worse. You become, in Arendt's conception, a superfluous man, a superfluous woman if you're a working class woman. You become part of what she calls the mob. Now, that word mob holds like a terrible connotation, and there's a reason for that we'll get to in just a moment. But first, let's just look at what Arendt writes in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, about what the mob is. On page, and I've got some printed notes here, but if you're using the expanded edition of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which is the edition I highly recommend getting, she writes on page 257, the rise of the mob out of the capitalist organization was observed early, and its growth carefully and anxiously noted by all great historians of the 19th century. She says they are the refuse of all classes. They made it seem, that is, that the mob and its representatives had abolished class differences. Okay, so the mob is the refuse of the proletariat, basically, in this case, the refuse of all classes. Now, there's also parts of the mob that are the refuse of the old aristocracy, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, if you were a lord or a lady, right, and you had privileges just for the sake of being born, if you were a feudal lord looking over your peasants, right, and then you lose that status as well, you might also end up becoming part of the mob. And so it's not just the working class that then gets, what she says, not just stepped out of society, but spat out by society, victims without use or function. You could be of any previous status or of any previous class in the class society, and if you are kicked out of it, if you find yourself outside of your class, you might make up what she calls the mob. Now, why does she use a word that's so judgmental? Mob. It's like, it describes, like we think about, like, I think even in German, the word mobben, the verb is like to bully, right? So when we think of the mob, we think of people who are part of some sort of a group with pitchforks and they're angry, right? And in fact, Hannah Arendt does say that part of what mob politics is the politics of resentment and anti-politics. As mob politics are born out of the passions and frustrations of such marginalized individuals. She says when someone is kicked out of their class, when they lose that identity, even with the class that might not have even made them particularly happy, people get angry. And when there is no other unifying bond, so in this case, the unifying bond would have been class status. When there's no other unifying bond, people are drawn to the politics of resentment. Individuals who in the very process are losing all natural connections with their fellow men. That's page 260. And you can see here that she's now starting to incorporate something other than mere economic status into our discussion. And that is why I'm bringing this up today, just so that you don't think I'm rambling on without a purpose. No, losing all natural connections with their fellow men. It's on page 260 of her book. That would put it squarely in the imperialist section of the book, if I'm not mistaken. No unifying bond, period. That means no economic bond via the fact that you were once part of the proletariat, for example, and you lost your job and now you're a superfluous man. You're part of the mob because of your economic condition. You have no unifying bond as well because you are becoming socially isolated. So how are you being socially isolated? Well, if you lived on the land prior to the Industrial Revolution and now you're living in the city, you are, to use Arendt's phrasing, rootless. You are uprooted. You are gone from the social bonds that you had out on the land with your family, with your small community, right? If you move out into the big city, you are suddenly atomized. You're suddenly alone. You're often forced to live away from even the rest of your family in order to survive economically. And now imagine, again, you get kicked out of your working class, you become a superfluous person, maybe you're sent abroad to participate in empire, but even if you stay home, you are going to have a lot of resentments because of your economic and your social, both of those things combined, isolation. And that is going to lead you, in the case of being part of this mob, this residue, or this refuse of all classes, as she says on 257, to behaving in a, generally speaking, bad way. Now, you might say that seems a little judgmental, the idea that somebody who's like down on their luck is going to immediately become part of like bad politics and is immediately going to be looking to like get their revenge out on the world. They're going to be part of the mob, right? This is where I want to start to bring us into the focus, a new focus. If we move forward in the timeline of Arendt's analysis, she's going to bring us to a new group of people that are less pejoratively described. And I want to suggest to you that Arendt, in describing this other group, the masses, hits on something that is quintessential to understanding our political moment right now, in the current year. Because the mob is a specific behavior type. Pull back the curtain a little bit on Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She mixes the term mob and masses quite often in a way that can be a little bit confusing. In fact, in one sentence, I found she uses the term mob masses. So there's not a perfect dividing line between the mob and the masses in her work, but there is enough of a distinction that I think I'm going to just go ahead and run with, and I want you to be aware of, because there's one way to go if you're down and feeling alienated, both economically and socially, right? The traditional Marxist understanding of the life post-industrial revolution focuses on the material, right? You are dispossessed of whatever it was you were doing before. You are economically alienated. You have, of course, alienation is an emotional state, right? It's both a material and an emotional state. But Hannah Arendt, what I'm trying to point out here, is that when she says the proletariat has it rough, that there are aspects of that is material economic. And that's not to say that other Marxists don't point this out. That Marxists don't point this out. But Hannah Arendt emphasizes that there's a very important social aspect here too, a social aspect of uprootedness that is perhaps underemphasized, though not absent from other Marxist interpretations. Now, if you're in that situation, if you're feeling superfluous, uprooted, alienated, right, you might join the mob. You might participate in bad politics. You might start to cause and effect. I am having a bad time. I want others to have a bad time. I want to call out the hypocrisy of bourgeois values. I want the world to burn, right? That's one way to go about living your life if you've had it rough, right? But Hannah Arendt is actually not saying that's where everyone will go. She's not saying that everyone's going to join the mob once they're having a bad, down on their luck moment in their life. What Hannah Arendt brings up next, a group of people that come in a little bit later in her interpretation, particularly in the third part, in the 20th century, when she's talking about the world after World War I, she brings up the masses. Now, again, we have to compare the masses to the Marxist interpretation of that word. For example, the Bolsheviks, when they took power in St. Petersburg in 1917 in the October Revolution, or the October coup, when they stormed the Winter Palace and took power on behalf of the working class, right, as a vanguard party, they said they were doing that on behalf of the masses. And when in that context, the masses are just the grand body of the proletariat, all of the working class. That's the masses, the world out there that isn't just the upper crest of bourgeois society. Hannah Arendt sees masses a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and look at how she defines the masses. The masses are more normal, right? The mob, they go through this similar process of becoming superfluous, and what happens is that they feel angry and they lash out, right? They behave badly. So in her book, chapter 4 is all about the Dreyfus affair, when a Jewish officer was falsely accused in France of spying for the Germans, and the mob flip-flopped all over the place in this sort of quasi-politics of, kangaroo court style. Let's just go after this guy, and let's definitely not acquit him of the crimes, even if there's plenty of evidence to say he's innocent, right? I think most of us are aware of what mob politics look like, because we live in an era in which there is mob politics, quasi-politics, this sort of like pseudo weird things that that basically come to identify the politics that don't really seem to have much bearing on actual policy and don't seem to address much problems, but seem based mostly in resentment. Masses, on the other hand, are people who are perhaps normal, and the thing that defines them most when they are kicked out of their class and when they lose their social bonds, when they become atomized individuals, that's a super important word in Arendt's writing, when they become atomized, along with their uprootedness, along with their superfluousness, when they become atomized, they become lonely. Running out of space here. The most important thing to think about the mass person, the mass man as Arendt would phrase it, is to think about the loneliness of the individual rather than what kind of politics they're going to participate in after becoming a déclassé, as she puts it in French, after becoming kicked out of the class system, after the idea of the traditional bourgeoisie and proletariat and peasant classes disappear from society. As individuals themselves not only become alienated economically, but they become alienated socially. They become lonely. They live alone. They live in atomized existences. She says loneliness is closely connected with uprootedness and superfluousness, which have been the curse of modern masses since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and have become acute with the rise of imperialism and the breakdown of political institutions and social traditions in our own time. It's a long quote, but she says they're lonely, they're uprooted, they're superfluous. This is a result of the Industrial Revolution, but she says it's not just an economic thing. She says it is a breakdown of economics, political institutions, and social traditions in our own time. So, generally speaking, when we talk about left populism, I can now bring this all the way around. Generally speaking, when we talk about a political message that is working today, the conventional wisdom out there is that to oppose populist politics of the right, to oppose the politics of the mob, right, what you need to do is you need to have left populism that addresses the material needs of the masses. People who aren't necessarily bad, right, but people who are feeling superfluous, feeling alienated, atomized, and most importantly, feeling lonely. And this is where I think the messaging, the standard left populism message that is becoming popular today misses something. And it is a place where, to now bring this all the way to Graham Plattner, I think in his speech, Graham Plattner and in his appeal expands the left populist message just a little bit in a way that is going to be highly effective going forward. Whether it's perfectly effective for Graham Plattner, I don't know. But what I am going to posit here from now on in the rest of the video is that he is hitting on something that's super important. Because Graham Plattner spoke about his personal alienation after getting out of the military and living some life being like downwardly mobile almost through society, of having served your country in combat and then coming home and feeling like, what was the point of all of that? Why have I been, perhaps you might say, spat out by society? And what he basically describes is that he joined what Arendt might have called the mob after he served in the military, that he was angry, that he had resentments. And whether we want to buy into his narrative or not, I don't know all the details. But the narrative that's being built, whether it's factually perfectly accurate or not, is that he was alienated, atomized, lonely, superfluous, and that he acted out, therefore, that he was part of the mob. And that part of his path to running for Senate and part of his personal transformation then is the transformation. I'm not saying he said this out loud, but this is what I'm seeing and what he's saying is that he translated his experience in the mob and being angry and acting out and getting weird tattoos and being bad to his fellow people, his feeling of uprootedness that led him down a bad path, that he repaired that and became part of the masses. And because he's now part of the masses, he can now identify with all those people up on the stage and all those people out in Maine. And the argument that I'd like to make here is that he's hitting on something very important that all politicians should be at least consciously aware of, even if they don't have a story that can necessarily relate to the masses of people. And the point is that the left populism is not sufficient if it is just material. I think one of the failings of the political left in this period is that there is an overemphasis on resentment and on, well, let's leave emotions out of it for a second, almost a hyperfixation on material things. That is, if the right is offering anger and emotions and non-solutions and just resentment populism, then the solution is to offer material things, to offer material solutions, is to offer technocracy. There's both. This is kind of encapsulated actually in both wings of the Democratic Party right now, in which some people are advocating for left populism in the form of democratic socialism, and some people are advocating left populism or whatever, material solutions in the form of like abundance, right? You'll notice that both of those wings are offering economic solutions to all of the feelings people are having, but what's often missing is the social aspects. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds really dangerous. It sounds really dangerous to bring up the idea that politics should offer more than just technocratic solutions, be they, this democratic socialist redistribution, or be it like sort of technocratic abundance stuff that is sort of the inheritor of neoliberal economics. The idea that we should add into the mix feelings, social aspects, that we should address the fact that people might want to join the mob, that there might be a legitimate appeal here, and that people kind of ride the line between the mob and the masses because they not only feel economic alienation like the proletariat, they don't only feel economic squeeze, they also feel concrete loneliness. They also feel socially atomized when they're stuck on their phones and they've lost connections with some of the people out of their lives, right? Even in the same room, you can feel quite lonely in modern society, right? Because you're scrolling, or if you're not scrolling, the person next to you might be scrolling, right? You go to work every day, you come home, you're in front of screens constantly, right? Obviously, everyone's experience differs. There's people who work with their hands and things. Not everybody's a knowledge worker, but you get the idea I'm putting out here, is that since the 1960s, really, there's been a decline in civic participation in our society. There was a famous book, Bowling Alone, that talked a lot about the fact that people in the United States are just not doing things outside of the home or outside of the workplace anymore. If you ever heard an online discussion or read something about third places, right? That's where this comes from, is the idea that we are not bowling in bowling leagues anymore, right? We're not joining churches. We're not joining political parties on the same level as we used to. We're not joining really any civic organization, be it political or social, at the rate that we used to, that peaked in the 1960s. American civil life has crumbled as people have felt the economic squeeze and the economic issues of our modern times, right? Since the 2008 financial crash, but going even further back, right? When people describe the squeeze on the middle class, and in a moment right now where that's particularly acute, right? There's also that accompanying social thing, that accompanying loneliness, that accompanying atomization, as though to say that when things are going bad, what we have also lost is our ability to just have people around us that also make us feel better, that can give us worth outside of our economic prosperity, outside of our material conditions, right? It's not to say that everything would be fine if we all were just like one happy family living in poverty together. It is simply to say that there are two sides of this equation that sometimes get underestimated, particularly then the social aspect when we're talking about people who are advocating for left populism. So the commentators that I heard today were talking about Graham Plattner's message in that speech, accepting his place in the Senate race against Susan Collins as the Democratic nominee, as a message that is offering people a sense that something generally is wrong. I'll just be specific about who I'm talking about. It was Ezra Klein and Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes, it was particularly surprising to hear him kind of miss this because he wrote a whole book about the feeling of alienation in the context of digital technology. But okay, they said that what Graham Plattner is doing is offering a feeling that there is something generally wrong. There's a general revolutionary feeling in the atmosphere. And they weren't pinpointing it exactly, and so that's why I've been talking now for, according to my timer, 43 minutes or so, to say that it's not a general sense of something being wrong, it is a specific sense. And I wrote some of the things down that are specifically wrong. The things that are specifically wrong are middle-class economic squeeze right now that I think even people who are relatively high earning, well above the average nationally, are feeling at this moment in terms of cost of living. That's a specific economic squeeze that only really the highest echelons of the K-shaped economy will not notice. But it is not simply that. It is the specific alienation people feel socially. It is the specific sense that they've been kicked out of their economic class, that they've been kicked out of their social bonds with other people, that they are lonely, and that generally speaking, that they are superfluous cogs in this giant machine. But even that much, they're the cog that has been taken out of the machine and left on the floor. And are you even there on the floor with other parts of the machine? No. All the other parts of the machine are not in a big pile. They're scattered all across the factory floor. And I think that metaphor is now a dead horse. That's going to be a mixed metaphor, beat to death, and I'm going to move on. And so there's another word in the speech. So I really you can see this isn't as much about Graham Plattner as what he's hitting on, but some of the words he's using that I think are correct in their analysis of the problem, right? Politics, political communication is about identifying a problem, then offering the solution, right? Graham Plattner obviously had plenty of left populist stuff in that speech. Okay, he talked about the billionaires doing this and whatever, like the politicians being bought, right? So some of that just general left populism, materialist economic stuff. But he used a different phrase that I think is really important here after using a phrase like alienation, right? That I think reflects more the atomized loneliness that people are feeling. He didn't refer to the bourgeoisie, obviously not, that's not really a word people use right now. But he used a term called the ruling class, right? Which I think encapsulates more than just the capitalist class, right? It encapsulates more than the bourgeoisie. The ruling class, it captures the sense that we are not just being economically dominated, but also that maybe we're being conscious, and this sounds a little loopy, but go with me here for just a second, right? That we're being influenced by algorithms, for example, and we're not actually interacting with fellow human beings. Our social bonds have broken down. And so we're not just being ruled economically, but when we basically sacrifice our consciousness itself to algorithms and to scrolling and to TV, which is obviously an older problem, but when the vast majority of our day takes place in a digital space, it's not just an economic thing that is happening. It is the fact that our economic and our social life is being dominated by a ruling class. Ruling class implies more than just economics, is what I'm getting at here. That when you go to work every day and you come home and you scroll and you don't interact with human beings, you don't have a civic organization to take part in, you're not just economically immiserated, you're also missing something spiritually. And to add to that, and something that I've talked about many times, right? When fascism comes around in the 20th century, right, and it offers something called palingenetic ultranationalism, that is the idea that there can be national rebirth through the fascist political project. When the fascist political project actually adopts some of the language of the left, when the Nazis call themselves the National Socialists, right, because they are accepting that there is some economic pain that people are feeling in the working class that they also need to address, not just the emotional rebirth, right? The fascist is balancing the economic and the emotional together, right? And when the left opposes fascism with only economic material arguments, what I'm suggesting is that that is a losing formula. To address a message to both economics and social problems is also to take a risk. And the reason that Hannah Arendt's book is called The Origins of Totalitarianism is because she identifies that in the modern world, people look to politics to transcend, to not just address one little corner of their lives, but to address the entirety of our lives. And she makes the argument later in the book that what totalitarianism did was take all of the subtleties and the miseries of life and boil politics down to a single fact or a single key to history, right? In the case of Nazi Germany, it was a racial question. In the case of Joseph Stalin and Stalinism, it was an economic class question. And just to be clear, what Hannah Arendt says is that totalitarians take so-called keys to history and then use and abuse them far beyond any like truth or falsity in the claims of the ideologies themselves. So don't think about the totalitarianism of Stalin in the context of Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin. Think about it only in the context of Stalin and totalitarianism. Don't think about the racial theories of Adolf Hitler in the case of just racial theories. It's about carrying through a single key to history to its logicality of a totalitarian movement. But we're getting a little bit too off the beaten trail right now. The point being that what totalitarianism offered to do, according to Hannah Arendt, is to basically resolve all of the angst and the loneliness and the anger and resentment, all of these things all at once with one clear key to history. When someone does that, they are inviting a lot of pain and suffering. When politics is forced through modernity to address some of this economic and social all at once in one political movement, there is intrinsic risk that things go horribly wrong. So this is not a video to say that everyone should just carelessly adjust their politics to address emotions as well as material conditions or social stuff along with economics. It's not just to say people should just blindly start combining these things, because if you're a good actor in the world, if you care about human flourishing, if you think that things that can suffer should suffer less and things that can flourish should flourish more, you got to be careful about how you go about doing those things. And I can't address that for you today. But what I can do is say that I think in Plattner's speech, that needle was being threaded. There was an attempt to thread the needle there, and it is that needle being threaded that a lot of conventional commentators messed up. And I really should have put this very up front and center, in that the conventional wisdom right now seems to be that Graham Plattner is winning because of his economic populism, and if he wins, it will be in spite of his personal failings. And what I am trying to say to you after all this time is that that's wrong, that he will win because of his economic populism perhaps, and not in spite of, but and because of the fact that he has had an experience with the lonely superfluousness, the alienation, the atomization that so many people feel in our uprooted modern times. And it is because of that that actually he might appeal to people more, not less.